Okay, thank you again for that wonderful introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank the Atlantic Institute, Piece by Piece, and Fountain Magazine for making this possible. And it's really delightful to see so many people here, and thanks a lot for coming out on 5 o'clock. I know it's a little bit late. I want to do something today. I want to present, most people think that what's driving the terrorist threat that we face is religion, specifically Islamic fundamentalism. I don't think that. I'm going to present a different view for what's driving the threat that we face. And I'm going to do it by presenting it to you as I myself came to be persuaded of this alternative view. You see, like probably many of you or many people that you know, I started with the belief that the threat that we faced on 9/11 was coming from was not just terrorism, but coming from Islamic fundamentalism. The 9/11 hijackers were, after all, Islamic fundamentalists. Why wouldn't I come to that view? And let me just tell you the story of how I got into this in the first place to help give you a bit of a sense of how this all started. On 9/11 itself, I really had a great honor. I was brought on the major TV shows in Chicago, along with our senators and Rahm Emanuel and our big politicians, to be the academic there to answer a question. How many people died that day? On 9/11, we didn't know whether 25,000 people died when the towers came down. Well, from my background on air power, I was able to say that had the planes been a cruise missile, we would estimate that the missile would cause a fire at the floor where it hit. And everybody from that point on down had a chance to get out, and so would get out. Everybody from that point on up would not. That allowed me to estimate that somewhere between 3,000 and 7,000 people died that day. Well, at the time, that was helpful because we had no idea how many people died. And then as I was on the shows, I was then the political scientist. And so you ask, what are the causes of terrorism? Well, as much as you would go to Rahm Emanuel or Senator Dick Durbin, they don't know much about those kind of questions. So it was natural that I was on the show that night and then for about a week. And increasingly, I was asked questions less about the casualties, because we got those counts, and more about the causes of terrorism. Right off the bat, I realized that what we faced wasn't just a terrorist attack, but a suicide attack. The 19 killed themselves in this process. And so as a professor, I began to prepare during the day for these interviews in the evening by going to the library to find the facts about suicide attack and suicide terrorism, because after all, I'm going to be asked all these questions. And I started to collect data. And I started to collect data on suicide attack and suicide terrorism. And I was really struck right away that I couldn't find a database. I couldn't find the data. And so I ended up compiling the first complete database of all suicide attacks around the world. I published that as part of an academic article a few years later. And before I did that, no academic did that, no think tank did that, no government had a global database. We had global database of ordinary terrorism, but not suicide terrorism, which led then to the major growth and development of this work. Now, as I was collecting that data, first of all, why suicide terrorism? Suicide terrorism is the lung cancer of terrorism, the biggest killer in the category. Terrorism is a lot like cancer. There are many forms of terrorism. Suicide attack kills more than any other form of terrorism and is best thought of as lung cancer, the lung cancer of terrorism. And like lung cancer itself, understanding that what we faced on 9/11 wasn't just the threat of terrorism, but the threat of suicide attack. That's what led to the 3,000 people dying that day. Means, well, maybe if we approach this like a medical researcher collects statistics and data on lung cancer, maybe we can find out by studying who gets this and who doesn't get it, the key risk factors. Now, when I began this, I thought the key risk factor was going to relate to Islamic fundamentalist person, deeply devout, going through this moment of transition, a crisis of religion or being unemployed or being too wealthy or something, that was going to lead to this pathway where there was going to be this transformation where that devout individual becomes violent. That's where almost everybody starts. If you join the CIA and you don't know anything, that's what you're going to think. It's called the spectrum of radicalization approach, and it's just the common sense from just looking at, oh, there's an Islamic fundamentalist. He was a suicide attacker. That must be what is driving it. But as I got into it, I ended up coming to a very different view, and what I want to do is show you some of the data today in this talk that led me to come to this different view. And I'm going to give you talks very similar to the talks I give to government officials, NATO. I've given talks to probably 75 of our intelligence organizations here, funded in part by the government, funded in part by private foundations here. NATO, I've given this talk to NATO conferences. So you're going to see, I've just recently, because of the rise of the ISIS threat, multiple talks to the FBI. So you're going to see abbreviated versions of this, and I'll even keep in some slides we're going to skip over here, but believe me, in the Q&A, I've been doing this 24/7 for over a dozen years. There's a lot of stuff we can talk about, and we'll be able to probably, I don't know, fully answer, but we'll be able to address many of your questions that we might not get to here in the talk and the Q&A. But first, let me just point out that what I'm going to do when I talk about suicide terrorism is I'm going to discuss this in the classic sense you would expect when I use that term, of an individual killing himself or herself on a mission to kill others. That strict definition is very important. This isn't just a high-risk mission. We're talking about suicide attack and suicide terrorism in the classic sense that you would expect when I use that term. Now, over the course of these dozen years, I've published 2 books, a special issue of a journal with not just myself, but other people, that have been about the causes of suicide terrorism to really understand these causes. And this isn't just academic work. In 2010, we had an all-day conference on Capitol Hill where this work came to Washington in a big way. One of the most important things that happened on Capitol Hill that day is Admiral Gary Roughead, then the serving head of the Navy, the CNO of the Navy. The Navy employs 350,000 adults they pay. So they make basically $100,000 a year. The CNO of the Navy is the #1 guy. He came to the conference and endorsed the findings from cutting the fuse. He didn't do that because Obama told him to do that. He didn't do that because Secretary Gates told him to do that. He did that because he didn't just read the book, he read the book, and then he wanted to know how good the data was underneath it. And he spent 2 weeks with his staff of 25 trying to tear the data apart. He couldn't tear the data apart, and that's what led him to want to support this book. And that's happened over and over again in Washington. What I would tell you is not that we're the majority view, but there is not just a fringe now anymore, it's a strong minority view point in Washington. So what you're hearing is not the lead story on Fox News, but you're not really hearing just this off-the-wall argument anymore. This really has changed over the last dozen years, although you're just now going to see the full depths of what's, I think, what's underneath this. So what is it about this data that's so important? So for those suicide attacks, I have a minimum 2 independent source rule. In order to count as a suicide attack, it must be a verified suicide attack. And the attacker must have killed himself or herself in the course of this mission. So the attacker must actually be dead from self-inflicted wounds. And I then present that data to the people, not just key people, but now to the public, in full disclosure. This isn't a verifiable database. This is a verified database that you yourself can go online if you want to today and verify the data. And I want to show you this because this is what allows the transparency to let people get inside the data and try to pull it apart. It's done with a research team. This isn't just done by me. We have people who speak all the key native languages you would expect: Arabic, Hebrew, Tamil, Russian, Urdu. We could do any language actually. The research team I have, we've collected now over 4,500 suicide attacks verified in the way I'm about to explain. And if you ever found a flaw, and I'll show you how to use the database in a second, they want nothing better than to go in and fix those flaws. That's what we do, and that's what we've done for a dozen years. So this really is the best data on suicide terrorism. Now, if you go to our website, Our website doesn't just do terrorism, there's other things there, but you'll see the button at the top for the suicide attack database. And this is all important to put on the web because we all know that in the internet age, the key question is how good is the data that we find on the web? Not just can we find data, is this something we can rely on? And folks, we're betting our lives on the findings here. This is not just something, oh, it's kind of nice to know. And you'll see what I mean in a moment. And it'll be very difficult as we get into it to really say, wait a second, oh, it doesn't really matter. And you'll see what I mean by that in a moment too. So this is like collecting statistics on lung cancer. You want the best statistics on cancer collected. And the reason is because it really matters to what you're going to do with your policies for the future. This is in a similar vein. Now, we go to the database, click on the database. The suicide attack database starts in 1982. That's when the first suicide attacks in modern times occur. Glad to explain that why in a moment. And this says only current up to July 2014. Actually, it's current as of 6 weeks ago. This slide's a little bit out of date, I'm afraid. And so we try to be up to date, and that's publicly up to date, where the data is publicly available, within 4 to 6 weeks, so near real time. Not to the very day, but it takes us that long to collect the data, verify the data, et cetera. And we don't just have 3,900 attacks, we're now up to about 4,500. But what's in the database and how good is the data? Well, you can start to search the database, and at first you just get a list of attacks, and you're not too surprised at this point. You see, you search the data, you get a list of attacks, and you see that first attack is an attack in Lebanon. Every one of those attacks has a card. Those cards track about 20 variables related to that attack. The date, the place, the weapon type, and then if you look at the bottom, often socioeconomic data, the names and socioeconomic data of the suicide attacker. If you want to know who becomes a suicide terrorist and why, you've got to have very detailed knowledge of the suicide attackers, not just general ideas and not just reading about one. Now, the question though is, how good is that data? Because after all, that's just a card full of data. At the bottom, you see sources, and they look like footnotes, but we do more than that. And you can click each and every one of those sources, and over to the right, you see the full text that verifies that data that's on the card. And we need a minimum of 2 independent sources that thick, okay, not just little footnotes, for each of the data points. And we often have 3, 4, and 5 independent sources of confirmation. So what's available online is not just the raw data that you can then number crunch, but the underlying sources so you can check up whether we have got the codings of the variables right or wrong. And so there's something like 15,000 documents on the web as well. And that's really helpful, again, to know how good is the data, and it's what breeds confidence in the data by folks who have used it in the government, academe, and elsewhere. This gives you an example of putting Arabic sources online as well, because not all of the information comes from English sources. Now, what's in the data? I want to talk about the data in 2 parts. First, the data from 1980s, the early 80s to 2003. Think about that as the world of suicide terrorism before the Iraq War and then after the Iraq War. In the first period, 1980 to 2003, the world leader in suicide terrorism is not an Islamic group. They're the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, a Marxist group, a secular group, a Hindu group. The Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka did more suicide attacks than Hamas or Islamic Jihad. Further, over a third of all Muslim suicide attacks were by purely secular groups such as the PKK in Turkey, which is a secular, not an Islamic fundamentalist group. Overall, about half of the attacks were clearly not done by Islamic fundamentalists. A fundamental problem for the argument that suicide terrorism is coming from Islamic fundamentalists in general. Do you see what I mean? Now, let me show you, and I won't spend too much time on the Tamils, but let me show you that the Tamil Tigers carry out suicide attacks in the classic sense you would expect when I use that term. These are two pictures of the actual suicide assassination of Rajiv Gandhi in May 1991. In this case, the Tamils didn't just make martyr videos, they videotaped actual suicide operations so they could study them to make them better. These are two frames. The cameraman in this case got so close he was killed in the blast. The Indian government rescued 10 frames from the camera, and these are two frames. The very top group is the group of the assassination team, but only one of them is the suicide attacker. You might just look at that top group and see if you can pick out which one you might think might be the suicide attacker. Most people will go with some stern faces. The suicide attacker is second from the right, Danu, the one who is the happiest, the most full of life. Has the garland. Danu, that's her down below, putting the garland around Rajiv Gandhi's neck. Rajiv Gandhi saw this woman and brushed his security guards away. He was protected. He was very protected. But he looked at her and thought, oh, I'll take the garland. And in the very next second after the bottom picture, she triggered a suicide vest under her garment, killing everyone in that picture, which I'll spare you those pictures. But the point here is that you can see that when I say the Tamil Tigers, a secular group, are doing suicide attack, I mean a suicide attack. I don't mean something that's kind of close to that. No, I mean defined in that specific sense you would expect. So what is, if it's not religion, what is driving suicide terrorism? Over 95% of all suicide attacks around the world are driven by a strategic logic to compel a democratic state to withdraw combat forces. I don't mean advisors with sidearms. I mean tanks, APCs, and fighter aircraft units from territory the terrorists consider to be their homeland or prize greatly. This military occupation has driven suicide terrorism first in the 80s and 90s in Lebanon and the West Bank, and now in Iraq and Afghanistan to today. This is the key cause, not of every suicide attack, but of about 95% of the suicide attacks that we have experienced. Now let me go a little bit deeper into the data. This slide shows you the 9 disputes that comprise the 95% of those suicide attacks. And if you let your eye go up and down the middle, you can see that territory was crucial in each and every one of these suicide terrorist campaigns. Let me pick Lebanon, the first one, to give you a quick example. In June, because of course you'll know Hezbollah, the famous suicide terrorist group, is Lebanese. In June 1982, Hezbollah did not exist. In June 1982, Israel invaded southern Lebanon with 78,000 combat soldiers, 3,000 tanks and armored vehicles. 1 month later, Hezbollah was born. Then over the course of the next year, and for reasons we're not really quite sure about, there are no fatwas here, Hezbollah seems to have just experimented with suicide attack. And the very fourth suicide attack was the famous suicide truck bombing of the US Marines in Beirut in October 1983. They killed 271 of our troops at the loss of just one of theirs. One of theirs. That's an extreme tactical ratio. However, the strategic benefits were even bigger. 4 months later, Ronald Reagan, no pacifist, decided to withdraw all American combat forces from Lebanon rather than face the risk of another suicide attack. That sent a message to terrorists, not just in Hezbollah, not just in Lebanon, but basically around the world, that suicide terrorism pays. This was a case where David didn't just hit Goliath in the eye and wound his eye. This is a case where David knocked Goliath out of the game. Very powerful lesson for a small group very few fighters, very few strategic options, and a lesson that doesn't just apply to an Islamic fundamentalist group. It's, in fact, the Tamil Tigers, their very first suicide attack in July 1987, was a carbon copy of the truck bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut. Very powerful. Now, I could go through and explain all those cases at this level of detail, and let me just show you. I'm also going to skip over. We have documents from the groups themselves, so I'm not just going to argue that this is all just about data and correlations of data. So we translate documents from the groups themselves. Much of this stuff you wouldn't necessarily see because it's not always in English. But I just want to just show you. I'm not going to read them for you in detail because you're going to see much more powerful stuff in just a moment. But I just want to show you how often we have specific documents from the terrorist groups themselves supporting what I'm saying. Al-Qaeda fits this pattern. This was the research, the first research to collect the names, socioeconomic data of the 69 individuals who actually carried out suicide attacks to kill themselves for Osama bin Laden from 1995 to 2004. Of those 69, we know the names, nationality, and other socioeconomic data of 65. Not all of them, but almost all. And as you can see, the largest number come from Saudi Arabia, the overwhelming majority from the Arabian Peninsula, where the United States first began to station combat forces in 1990. It's important to underscore to any audience that 1990 is a watershed year in our military deployment to the Arabian Peninsula. Yes, before 1990, the United States had some advisors, mostly Marines with sidearms standing in front of embassies on the Arabian Peninsula, but no tanks, no fighter aircraft, no combat units going all the way back to World War II. We deployed those combat forces in 1990 to kick Saddam out of Kuwait. We kicked Saddam out of Kuwait by March 91, and we never left. And the presence of those combat forces were the best recruitment and mobilization appeal that Osama bin Laden ever had. That is the key thing to know, because if you don't know that, then putting in more troops easily can make matters worse. Let me go a little bit further. Rather than just take my word for it, let's let you listen to the 9/11 hijackers themselves. I'm going to show you the 4 martyr videos from the 9/11 hijackers. They're going to speak to you in Arabic, and then it's been translated so you can read what they're saying in English. I'm also going to show you 2 martyr videos from the 2 of the London suicide bombers who carried out suicide attacks for Al-Qaeda in London in July 2005. Altogether, these are 6 of the most notorious Al-Qaeda suicide bombers. Let me just let you listen to them as they explain their motives.
This is how our ethical stances are dictated. Your democratically elected governments continuously perpetuate atrocities against my people all over the world, and your support of them makes you directly responsible, just as I am directly responsible for protecting and avenging my Muslim brothers and sisters. Until we feel security, you will be our targets, and until you stop the bombing, gassing, imprisonment and torture of my people, we will not stop this fight. We are at war, and I'm a soldier.
وأقول للقيادة الأمريكية إن أرادت سلامة جيوشها وشعبها فلتسحب جميع قواتها من بلاد المسلمين ولتخرج من جميع أراضيهم، وإلا فلتنتظر الرجال ولتجهز توابيتها وتحفر قبورا لأبنائها ولتستعد لأن تذوق الويل والوبال القادم على قياداتها وشعبها بإذن الله.
وإن من المصائب العظام التي أصيبت بها الأمة الإسلامية هي احتلال بلاد الحرمين من قبل الجيوش اليهودية الصليبية وعلى رأسها أمريكا، وإن هذا الاحتلال أكبر خيانة وكارثة في تاريخ الإسلام، فلم تغز جزيرة العرب من مثل هذه الجيوش الأمريكية الجبارة التي تنقر أساطيل
لماذا يمكن اليوم في بلاد المسلمين احتلال واضح لا غبار عليه، وأنتم أيها العلماء تقولون هذا وتقرونه حتى لبلاد الحرمين؟
كيف لا؟ ونحن قد نهمنا في بيت ربنا ومسجد نبينا وقبلتنا ومقدساتنا، واحتللنا من قبل اليهود والنصارى، وهي أعظم مصيبة بعد مصيبة وفاة الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم. ومما يزيدها عظما أن هذا الاحتلال تم بالتعاون مع الحكام المرتدين. وجزيرة العرب منذ أن خلق الله صحراءها وحفها ببحارها لم يدهمها مثل هذا البلاء قط، فإنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون. وما بلاد الحرمين فيه من احتلال وتردي هو مخطط من اليهود والنصارى، وعلى رأسهم أمريكا دمرها الله، التي ما نزل بالإسلام والمسلمين من مصيبة إلا كانت سببا فيها.
What you have witnessed now is only the beginning of a series of attacks which inshallah will intensify and continue until you put all your troops out of Afghanistan and Iraq, until you stop all financial and military support to the US and Israel, and until you release all Muslim prisoners from Dalmash and your other concentration camps. I know that if you fail to comply with this, then know that this war will never stop, and that we are ready to give our lives 100 times over for the cause of Islam. You will never experience peace until our children in Palestine, our mothers and sisters in Kashmir, our brothers in Afghanistan and Iraq feel peace.
So what you are seeing is powerful evidence, both in the data and from the attackers themselves, that military occupation is the principal trigger of suicide terrorism. I'm not saying other factors don't matter at all, but it's important to see that military occupation, which can come in two forms, either an external occupation, where a government, say the United States, comes in, occupies a country from afar, that's one group occupying another from afar, or an internal occupation, where one internal group, say Shia, occupy a group of, say, Sunnis, or in the case of the Tamil Tigers, the Sinhalese, who are Buddhists, occupy the Tamils, who are Hindu. You can have either an external occupation or an internal occupation, but that occupation is the key risk factor. Now, why is that? Why would military occupation, that presence there, be such a key risk factor for suicide attack? It's because the presence of those military forces means that local group cannot change the government. They cannot change the government. There's a government by one group of people over another group of people, and that dominant group is supported by military power. The local group can't change the government. Now, why does that matter? Because governments control the politics, the economics, but also the social systems. The social systems. So the local populations often feel like their way of life is being threatened and jeopardized. That's what creates the urgency for the military occupation. So when we think about, let's say, women's rights in Afghanistan, and we have put an army in Afghanistan, and we have essentially installed a government in Afghanistan, keep in mind that there may be, I'm not saying we shouldn't have women's rights in general, I'm not attacking that concept, but keep in mind that when we impose it at the barrel of a gun, where there's no choice for the local population, that's the loss of self-determination. That's a loss of self-determination. I asked people to imagine what it would be like if the Chinese deployed a 50,000-man army to Atlanta, even if Obama signed off on it, and then started to suggest, well, maybe the politics in Atlanta should have some Chinese characteristics, just to fit in, just so that we could have, and then the government is simply installed by the Chinese. You're telling me nobody would oppose that? You're saying nobody would see that as a threat to the American way of life? I don't think so. I think we would see that as a pretty direct threat to the American way of life. And even if the government in Washington was supporting that, many people in the local population would oppose it and oppose it extremely violently. That's what I'm trying to tell you is the principal cause of suicide terrorism. Not every suicide attack, but about 95%. Now, if that is the logic, then what would you expect if we have more suicide attack, more occupation? You would expect more suicide terrorism, and that's the world from 2004 on. From 2004 on, we have many times the number of suicide attacks that occur around the world because we are occupying very large pools of Muslims in a way that we did not do before. So if you want to know why is it it's so Islamic, well, it's because that's who we're occupying. Now, to be specific, just to show you the changes, we have new suicide terrorist campaigns in direct response to the new occupations, and those are the famous ones you know quite a bit about. You might not know that much about Nigeria, but Nigeria is mostly a Christian state. The government is mostly Christian, those of you might not know, and then the local Boko Haram are the Muslims who are rejecting control from that alien, as they see it, way of life. Old campaigns ended as the occupation itself ended. We are beginning to see some suicide terrorist campaigns against non-democracies. I've gone to China 8 times in the last couple years. There are a couple of suicide attacks. They're still occurring in very small numbers. I could talk about that if you would like. But this gives you a sense of the change that's occurred. Now, I often go through Afghanistan in some depth here, especially in a military audience, because you could imagine NATO and Afghanistan. I'm not going to really do that in great depth today. I'm just going to tell you and just assert the finding, and I'm glad then to go over this in great depth later. What happened in Afghanistan is that there was virtually no suicide attacks until 2006. Why is that, and why did they begin to even come up in 2005? And we have lots of data on the suicide attackers and so forth. So tons of data here I'm skipping over. It's because that's when we actually sent our forces to occupy the country. We did not occupy the whole country with just a tiny number of troops. We occupied that whole country later, starting in 2005. This is the actual military plan to do it, and that's when it's basically Pashtun suicide terrorism, when we occupy the Pashtuns, and basically as we occupy Pashtunistan, it explodes. But I don't have a lot of time, so I'll be glad to go through any of those questions on Afghanistan that you want to. What I do want to show you in Afghanistan, though, is this is when in 2006 the most important video came out from Al-Qaeda to recruit homegrown terrorists to kill us. They wanted to recruit specifically American, British, and Australian Muslims to carry out attacks to attack inside of those countries, the homegrown terrorists. The person I want to show you this video from was the key video. His name is Adam Gadan. He's an American. He was born in Riverside, California. He went to live with Osama bin Laden in the 1990s in Afghanistan, and then in 2006, this was his coming out video when he showed his face for the first time, and he was the poster child for recruiting homegrown terrorists. And so I just want to let you listen to his pitch so that you can see how he's trying to recruit them. And hopefully we'll get the...
It's crucial for Muslims to keep in mind that the Americans, the British, and the other members of the coalition of terror have intentionally targeted Muslim civilians and civilian targets, both before as well as after September 11th. In both the first and second Iraq wars, as well as in their forays into Somalia and the Sudan and Afghanistan, just to give you a few examples. And they've done this with the support and backing of their populations and electorates. I mean, even if there have been some feeble protests scattered here and there in the West, chiefly against the latest war in Iraq, all the same, the governments which started these wars have been re-elected by a majority of the popular vote. In their aggression against Afghanistan, which for Westerners and their mercenary sympathizers is the least controversial of Bush and Blair's terrorist wars, They have targeted civilians for assassination and kidnapping. They kidnapped any non-Afghans they found and shipped them off to Guantanamo or worse. Many were handed over to the American and British-backed despotic regimes of the Islamic world to be brutally interrogated. And with the blessing and support of that notorious Afghan killer, Hamid Karzai, they've murdered thousands of Afghan civilians as they slept in their beds, traveled on the roads, attended weddings, and prayed at the mosques. I know they've killed and maimed civilians in their strikes because I've seen it with my own eyes. My brothers have seen it. I've carried the victims in my arms. Women, children, toddlers, babies in the mother's wombs. You name it, they've probably bombed it. I could go on, and that's just Afghanistan. We haven't talked about American and British atrocities in the two Iraq wars. Let's take a look at the latest to be revealed. In Mahmoudiyah, 5 American soldiers gang rape an Iraqi woman, and then to hide the evidence, murder her and 3 members of her family and burn her body. And then, when our mujahideen take revenge on the unit which committed this outrage and capture and execute 2 of its members, they're called terrorists, and Muslims are supposed to disown them or face the consequences. And I'm not saying that we should go and slaughter their women and children one by one like they did ours at Haditha and Ishaqi and Mahmoudiyah and God knows where else, even if some of our legal experts have permitted that. And even if it's hard to imagine that any compassionate person could see pictures, just pictures of what the Crusaders did to those children and not want to go on a shooting spree at the Marines' housing facilities at Camp Pendleton. But what I am saying is that when we bomb their cities and civilians like they bomb ours, or destroy their infrastructure and means of transportation like they destroy ours, or kidnap their non-combatants like they kidnap ours, no sane Muslim should shed tears for them. And they should blame no one but themselves, because they're the ones who started this dirty war, and they're the ones who will end it, by ending their aggression against Islam and Muslims, by pulling out of our region, and by keeping their hands out of our affairs. And until and unless they do that, neither forced state-style police raids, nor Belmarsh or Guantanamo prison cells, nor the mosques and imams advisory council will be able to prevent the Muslims from exacting revenge on behalf of their persecuted brothers and sisters.
So, no 72 virgins. Hardly any discussion of Islam as a religion. From beginning to end, this is an empathetic plea to respond to the plight of a kindred population, a Muslim population to be sure, kindred population that's facing atrocities from an occupation. And atrocities that you could read about every day, not quite every day, but very often in the papers yourselves. He's not making those stories up. He's not giving us any credit for us policing ourselves. Mind you, I'm not saying that he's painting a neutral picture here, but he is painting this compelling picture, and it's very important to see that what's motivating people to sign up and to fight and to die is very understandable once you see the logic. I'm not morally condoning it, but I'm saying that if we don't understand the actual logic that they're recruiting with, large numbers of them will feel more in control of their lives. And that takes away the key energy for the suicide terrorism that we faced. So with that, let me stop there and take your questions. Thanks. Yes, ma'am.
Question. First, when you said airstrikes, can you talk about the drones in Yemen? Because there's a lot of talk about how it's mainly non-troops on the ground, it's mainly drones. There's a lot of talk of how that is creating a lot of mischief.
Yeah, so I am not arguing for replacing mass boots with mass drones. And I've argued for quite some time that what we have done with our drone program is way overdone the drone strikes. The purpose of the drone strikes are to attack the, quote, high-value target, which is a leadership target, And if you follow what I just showed you with that one example of Zarqawi, we killed Zarqawi, but then things just went right back up and even got a little worse. That's common with leadership decapitation. So I've been studying leadership decapitation for about 25 years because of my work on air power. So quite a lot of effort here. And there's a really quite dramatic pattern, whether it's states attacking the leaders of states or states attacking the leaders of terrorist groups, which is that leadership decapitation really has very marginal and only short-term effects, and sometimes puts in power, allows for a young buck to rise up, because it's not always the case that the worst guy is the one who's already at the top. There's examples of that. So the drone strikes, I think, have usefully been pulled back since 2011. And basically what happened is once we finally killed Osama bin Laden, and how did we get bin Laden? Offshore balancing. Special forces went in to kill him, and then they left. There was no ground army in Afghanistan that helped at all. Abbottabad is too far away from Afghanistan. That was an example of offshore balancing. Notice there was no drone strikes because when we had an actual high-value target, we had to get the DNA. It wasn't good enough to just think maybe we killed them. We needed to know. So the drone strikes, basically, I'm not saying we should never have any, but they've been way overdone, and they're producing tons of suicide attackers in response. We're getting very little benefit that really matters. And so I think that, you know, we maybe could have a couple a year, something like that. But the truth is, when we find a real high-value target, we want the DNA. Yes, sir. I'll come back. I'll let you come back later. Let me get a few more people in.
Do you think ISIS challenges some of your assumptions regarding empirical relationships?
Well, just, yeah, go ahead and unpack that, please.
No, I was wondering if, because ISIS strikes me as a new phenomenon, as a movement because it managed to consolidate land.
Oh, I see, I see. That's only,
does it
yeah.
challenge some of the assumptions that,
Yeah.
that you might have formed when you wrote, for example, you know?
Right, so I have long argued that suicide terrorism is a product of nationalism. So just to, one of the slides I skipped over, some of the deeper logic here, which is in the books, and we could go into it in some detail. Just a minute. But you'll see that nationalism and national self-identity is the core of that self-determination. ISIS is the perfect manifestation of that. So far from challenging it, they've just decided to go and make it the case. So a lot of people have been thinking, oh, well, these religious groups, it's a global jihad. They don't want states. They don't want territory. What a religious group is this global jihad that swirls anywhere around the world. And so it's not connected to any territory. What I've been arguing for 10 plus years is, no, it's nationalism where a group of people want to control their own territory for self-determination over the population in that territory. That's exactly what ISIS is doing, and I think the reason it's surprising many people is because many people think, again, that this is driven by religion. Religion isn't territorial, and therefore, why is ISIS building a state? And they're not just, and if I showed you their recruitment videos, they don't just want attackers, they want scientists, they want journalists, they basically want a full-blown state in that territory. Just one second, I'll come over here and then I'll come back to you guys. Yes, ma'am.
Which is why France refuses to call them ISIS. They use another name for them, which is not always a popular name to use, but the French government has refused to call them ISIS because they're not an Islamic state.
Okay, so I definitely think that we should not legitimate. I think that President Obama is really smart to try to divorce the concept of religion from terrorism. It's driving a lot of people nuts because they want religion and terrorism to go together. I think Obama is doing that. The French government is doing that. Governments are doing that. Why? Because they've seen a lot of this data. That's why. It's because they're not just following this from Fox News or the news media in general. And I don't mean to just pick on Fox. CNN is just as bad. And so I'm not really trying to pick on one side here, because the phenomenon of believing it's religion is really pretty broad. It's not really a Republican or a Democratic issue. And so I do think it's important to not continue to perpetuate the myth that it's really about religion. And at the same time, however, exactly what we call them here, we should just realize a lot of governments are making just simply a political decision. It's about not the reality, it's about the politics and the framing. And that is just something that goes hand in hand with being a politician in the TV age. So they got, 6 seconds on TV, and they're trying to figure out how to get those 6 seconds out there. And notice you can't get into any serious discussions here in 6 seconds. So just be aware that that's one of the big things that's limiting a lot of the political discussion. Yes, sir, in the back. In the glasses, please.
This is great work because most of the conclusion are backed by empirical evidence. We don't hear from politicians and people talking about the causes of terrorism. But one point where I wasn't convinced was that if indigenous groups control the oil, they wouldn't sell it. To me, that doesn't make any sense. Even ISIS, right?
Yep.
They raise money by selling oil. To me, they would sell oil. We might not agree with their views and what they do with it, but in that one.
Yeah. First of all, you may be 100% right that ISIS may, in fact, sell oil. And if they sell oil, we're fine. Okay? I'm telling you that the reason we're in the Persian Gulf is access to oil. Okay? No one wants to put it that bluntly, but that's the big reason we're in the Persian Gulf. I don't believe it's really about Israel. I don't really believe it's about spreading Christianity. I don't believe we've somehow done this through historical path dependency. I think oil is really the...
To start my question, is there any empirical evidence that any group would kind of deny their biggest economic asset and not make use of it so they can consolidate it?
That's a good question, actually. That's a really good question. Because you may be right that actually until now, see, we haven't seen the situation that would really be the crucial test. So the problem with the question isn't that you're not necessarily, you may be right actually, and I'm not really trying to tell you that I'm sure you're wrong. Don't get me wrong. Just thinking through the problem. The real issue is no group has controlled enough of those resources that we could really seriously test that equation, because that's really the $64,000 way to think of the data. You need data that actually fits the question that you're asking. And I think that, but just to go back, so one of the reasons why I'm perfectly happy with Sunnis controlling their future is because I think that if you had somewhat more moderate leadership in this thing, change the name. We wouldn't call it ISIS anymore. The leadership of the Sunni community in Iraq and Syria, you probably would get quite reasonable policies with them selling oil. And so I'm not trying to say that we should just prevent the Sunnis from ever controlling their future, but I am trying to point out that the way ISIS is behaving, they are the Frankenstein monster that we have produced. Okay, so this is not a group that is even as, sort of AQI was modest by ISIS standards. And it's because they've been through the cauldron now of nearly 10 years of intense civil war on top of the structural problems I'm painting. Yes, sir.
You answered actually this question earlier when you said that it would be in their long-term interest. Well, it didn't explicitly say it, but
right.
You implied that it would be in their long-term interests economically to bring down our economy. So so hold it. Just to kind of walk through some of this logic, the long-term interest here of growth and building a state is in fact trade. So the reason he's asking the question is because he's thinking here, well, wait a minute, if they want to build a state, wouldn't they trade? The problem here is that we have stuck our nose into the politics of the Middle East so many times, okay, especially in the last 10 years. How confident would you be if you're a leader in the Middle East, we're not going to do it again? And so you'd be very tempted
to basically crush the American or the Western economy over a 3 to 5 year period for pure strategic reasons, rational reasons, because what you're fearing is the repetition of the same. And what happened? ISIS takes Mosul, right? And you have not just Obama's air campaign, but you have calls in the United States to do much more. Hillary Clinton, by the way, is criticizing Obama for doing too little against ISIS. So this isn't a Democratic and Republican issue. So you have basically Obama in the middle, and he's being criticized on both the left and the right, who both want more aggressive policies. And so if you're ISIS or you're any leader watching that, you're not going to be confident that the Americans are going to leave you alone. So anyway, that's why I'm on two minds of this. It's because there's the near-term issue of predicting ISIS's behavior in the near term, which could likely be very crippling to us. But then over time, the structural fact of the price of oil is going to be attractive. Yes, sir, you've been trying for a long time. I'm sorry, I can't quite hear.
Occupation that causes the violence.
That's right.
You showed a slide there that has a black, going up into Europe, into Spain, into the...
Oh, that's the one that you see on TV that's not real. Sorry. That slide's a little too busy. My research team, I now have a research team that helps me build slides, and they keep trying to get more information in every slide because they keep saying, Bob, you got to understand, your audience wants more information. I keep saying, well, wait a minute, no, we break them into several slides. But what that slide is really trying to tell you, sir, and again, maybe a little bit badly, that question of 5-year plan, that's just not real. That's not from ISIS itself. That's what has been made up as the ISIS 5-year plan that's not real. The one that's in the middle, where it's called ISIS Envisioned Boundaries, that's what ISIS leaders themselves are saying.
But you didn't talk about wanting to go back up in Andalusia. Is that all made up?
I'm telling you, this is from the documents. We have several 400-page documents from ISIS. They're in Arabic. We translate them. So I'm not telling you what is just, printed in the newspaper as, the truth here about ISIS from some reporter that got it from some other reporter that got it from some other reporter. I'm telling you what's coming from ISIS itself. And what's coming from ISIS itself is that big map, sir. What you're seeing posted around the internet and so forth is a lot of stuff that's just simply made up. And there's lots of people that can post anything they want on the internet. We do live in an internet world where there's lots of garbage on the internet, and that's what I'm trying to, show you in parts of this data. But you're right to bring that up because the truth is this is my research team's effort to try to get more on one slide than probably is reasonable. Do you want to say another word?
Envy and wanting something that somebody else owns, has. Maybe there's some truth to that his philosophy.
Yeah.
Yes. Land, I don't like you having it, I want it.
Yep. So the key question here is somebody may be greedy and want something else. When are they willing to die to get it? Because when they're dead, they don't get that extra stuff. Somebody else has to get it. So they're going to be dead. So if it really was driven by a logic of greed, then economists would be able to explain suicide terrorism relatively straightforwardly. I'm not trying to tell you that somebody can't dream of having a dream of more. My job is to predict what they're actually going to die for by looking and tracking what they have actually died for in the past, and then trying to see what are the bounds of that going forward. And so what I'm telling you is not that that's not deductively possible, but it really does pose a puzzle, which is if you're really greedy, why are you dying for that greed? Because you're never going to consume it. Yes, sir.
So a question I wanted to ask, not to try to burden you with too many hypotheticals.
That's okay.
But especially because this theory or the logic that you're following is how we should approach future situations.
Right.
So if you can apply to a past situation, assume the American Revolution took place today.
Yep.
With the occupation of British soldiers in America, do you think we'd see Americans displaying the same kind of strategy?
Yeah, so there's an extra dimension. So I've given you the number one risk factor of suicide terrorism, which is occupation. Let me just throw, a slide up. And, whoops, there we are. To actually look at the full cocktail, there are other conditions. Not every occupation escalates into suicide terrorism. So in Dying to Win, I did a detailed study of democracies that have occupied, and I wanted to know what is that additional risk factor, or several, and there's not just one, but there's one I want to tell you about, that leads to the secondary cause. The main issue here with occupation is you have one distinct group occupying another distinct group. So that group B fears that its lifestyle is going to be distorted by group A. So the bigger the distance between them socially, the more B should likely fear that way of life being changed. And so what I did is I said, well, what about religious differences of the predominant religions in the different areas of the occupier and the occupied community? And it turns out that is the most important secondary risk factor. Not because when you have a religious difference, the local community is always a religious terrorist group. The Tamil Tigers are purely secular suicide terrorists, but there's a religious difference where the predominant religion of the Sinhalese is Buddhism. The predominant religion of the Tamil population is Hindu, even though the Tamil Tigers themselves totally reject Hinduism as their religion. And what's underneath that is when you have a religious difference, the terrorist leaders can demonize the occupier as driven by religion. It's the occupier, in Osama bin Laden's language, us, we're the crusaders. We're the Christian crusaders who want Christians to take the oil from the Muslims. We're the Christian crusaders who want to convert Muslims into Christianity. We're the Christian crusaders who want to damage Islam. That's the language that Osama bin Laden uses to explain why America is going to the Persian Gulf. And notice how we do want the oil, or access to the oil, you see. So anyway, so that means if you look at other occupations, you can start to use the religious difference as a predictor.
Right, but even with that, obviously there was strong, it was the same, as we would see today, not as much of a difference between, Catholic and Protestant or whatever. There obviously at the time was, not as much towards the end, but, with the clash of religion there was obviously a strong clash.
So there's no doubt that there is an earlier period here where between Catholics and Protestants we had the Reformation, religious wars, et cetera, et cetera. We actually don't know enough about the history to know whether there were suicide attackers. We do know there were many, many martyrs who were willing to die rather than abandon their way of life. And they were put to death by the other religion, you see. So it's not quite identical, I don't want to say that. But what we're facing today with the Sunnis and the Shia is something like a bit of the Reformation 500 years later. So there is something to what you're explaining. But my point would be, what I would stand as a test, however, would be even assuming splits within Christianity. One of the biggest predictions that comes out of this would be, what if there was a single state over the area of Israel and the Palestinians? And that single state wasn't governed by Jews, was governed by the Palestinians. So that you now would have a minority population being the Jews in a Palestinian governed state. That is the real possibility, or the hypothetical, for Jewish suicide terrorism in the future. And the Jews were the first suicide attackers in history. The first suicide attackers in documented history are the Jewish zealots in Zechariah in the 1st century AD. They were opposing Roman occupation at the time. So it's not the case that we've never seen Jewish suicide attackers. It's the case that, anyway, but the bottom line is we can actually draw out predictions that come from the theory for the future, and I think that's what social science should do. Yes, sir.
So recently there was a lot of media buzz about the iconoclasm that ISIS was carrying out. I think they destroyed what they saw as Mesopotamian pagan idols.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just really surprised by that because it seemed like a more abstract action than everything else they were doing. Do you think that represents religious affiliation or?
Oh, it undoubtedly does. I mean, I think what you're seeing is, so there was an Atlantic piece by a person by the name of Wood a couple weeks ago that said ISIS is all religion all the time and it's purifying religion and so forth. That's undoubtedly the case that there are religious fanatics inside of ISIS. But I would just tell you that the actual leadership is composed of the triumvirate that I just laid out for you, which means that if that religious fanaticism gets out of hand, that's going to open the doors to splitting ISIS. So it's possible that religious leadership could kill off the other 2/3 of the leaders, but then once you start to, you better kill them all fast because, so it's not so easy to come in and have a coalition of groups fight together here to make gains, and then for 1/3 of it to decide it's going to run the show. If you do that, you face the risk of simply splintering, and so the problems of that consolidation are real, and they occur in other cases as well. Yes, ma'am.
What are your thoughts on initiatives by the State Department, like Think Again, Turn Away, and the other, was it the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communication? What are your thoughts on that?
So my big thought is that it's not doing very much good, or else we wouldn't have this problem. Okay. Two things to say about this. Number one is that there's an alternative policy for our public communication policy, our propaganda policy, which is to talk about the assistance that the United States and the West have given to Muslims. So as I just said in response to another question, Osama bin Laden takes this difference and then says these Westerners are out to hurt us as a community. Well, we haven't always just hurt Muslims. In fact, we often are helping them tremendously. Bosnia, the 1990s, the Muslims were under pressure from Serbs and Croatians who are Christians. And what did we do? The Americans and the Europeans went in and sided with the Muslims in that case. We didn't just pick sides with Christians against the Muslims. When was the last time you heard the State Department talk about that? Okay, the tsunami relief, 2004. Tsunami had a tremendous impact of many Muslims in the Pacific and in the Indian Ocean. And we, in the United States and Europe, provided many hundreds of millions of dollars of direct assistance. When was the last time you heard the State Department talk about that? You really haven't. And so I think that the idea of just say no, I think that this is not, hasn't been very effective. There are some alternatives. Now, one other point to tell you is, so in the future, I'm putting together the pieces of a martyr video project. So I've collected not just these videos, but about 150 martyr videos, basically all the martyr videos in the world. And you can't get these on YouTube because that's why you're not going to get copies of these, because this is the real recruitment and martyr videos. And I'm partnering with one of our psychologists at the University of Chicago who does fMRI studies for empathy. He often brain scans prisoners to find out things about sociopathy and stuff like that. What we're going to do is brain scan people as they watch martyr videos because we want to actually collect the hard data about what's happening with the appeal. Basically, is the appeal driven by an emotion-based issue or a cognitive issue? That we can tell to a pretty good degree, not perfectly with brain scans, which is why, by the way, when you listen to Katy Perry videos or music, it sounds so good because people have been MRI'd and they know how to make them fit. When you do Super Bowl ads now, you don't just put a Super Bowl ad and have a focus group anymore, you MRI it. Okay, so what I'm trying to do is basically bring our standards of counter propaganda or counter information up to how we handle the Super Bowl or Katy Perry. Yeah.
What do you think are the obstacles to a national unity government in Iraq? Do you think we need an American-Iranian agreement regarding the whole?
Yeah, so a national unity government, as it really, if it was really going to work very well, would look more like Bosnia. So in Bosnia, we also have 3 groups. And in 1995, we effectively had an end of a civil war. The war ended because of demographic separation. Many hundreds of thousands of people, that is about 25% of the entire population, had to move. It's not just a small number of people. And then we encouraged a unity government, it was called, but the government is a weak centralized government. It's a triumvirate of 3, 2 of whom have to agree, and if the 2 don't agree, nothing happens. Well, try to do that with the Shia government in Baghdad, you see. So the true idea of a unity government here, I think, is probably pretty difficult. What I think is much more realistic is to try to encourage more direct economic autonomy for the Sunni areas. It is not the case that the Shia government has to cut off economic assistance flowing to the Sunni areas. It's not the case that they have to crush them, okay? That is a completely different story, all right? And so I think that in general we should be moving toward that kind of economic autonomy, not necessarily breaking states apart, but more economic autonomy here at, say, the municipal levels than we have seen. And I think that might be a better future. Yes, sir.
Going back to the Sunni awakening,
Yep.
which you characterized as being caused by our economic assistance paying them
Yep.
to kill us.
Right. You're seeing that. Yep.
And then, but we reduced that.
Yes.
And what were the factors that led us to reduce that and to substitute for that military troops?
Well, we didn't put in the troops yet, okay? What we did is we handed it off to the Maliki government. And there was a big debate at the time about whether we should do this, and it was decided by the ambassador in Iraq, Chris Hill, and some others to go ahead and do that. I think that's a tactical mistake that's now causing big strategic problems. And so those decisions, which are under the radar of the public's not paying attention to these decisions, can be pretty consequential here. And that's why I think that it's important to talk about the offshore balancing policy and then the economic assistance here and the details of it a little bit more. So I realize that's asking people to get into the details a little bit, but it's because some of those details really do have pretty big strategic consequences. And this is just one where we made a mistake. So I would not have advised that. I thought it was a mistake at the time. I'm not telling you the Obama administration is perfect by any stretch of the imagination. I'm just telling you that they're more in the middle of the road. And I'm pretty sure they themselves get it, because the first thing Obama did, even before air power last July, was put pressure to get Maliki out. I mean, they definitely get this logic that I'm describing for you. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for your talk. I noticed in one of your barcodes, Morocco was right after Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
And yet I know something about Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, there's no occupation in Morocco.
Is it solidarity with any Saudi influence, or is
Yeah.
it Moroccans outside Morocco living in Europe?
Yep. So just to, so I'm going to give you I'll give you a sound bite, but Chapter 7, Dying to Win, goes into this. So 2/3 of the al-Qaeda suicide attackers come from Sunni communities under American occupation in the straightforward sense of military forces supporting a government that the population can't vote for. Okay, so that's what I mean by how extreme this is. 1/3 do not. 1/3 do not. And if you look at the 1/3, they tend to come from Morocco and also Egypt and also Jordan, which are the biggest recipients of American economic aid. I don't know if you know, some people think America gives out tons of aid to countries around the world. We're one of the stingiest states in the world. We hardly give out economic aid. The couple of places that get economic aid are Egypt, Morocco, and Jordan. And no surprise, those are the governments that aid is helping to keep in power. Those are the governments that Osama bin Laden said were among the most repressive regimes in the world that he extended to it. And just to give you a sense of how important that aid is, you might remember with the Arab awakening in Egypt, there was an issue here with Mubarak, and there was an issue with the military. What did Obama do? He picked up the phone, talked to the head of the military in Egypt, and within hours, they obeyed and did what we told them to do with Mubarak. That aid is not just, given, without strings attached. There's a lot of control that goes with that aid. Now that's a secondary factor. I don't say it's military occupation. I'm not trying, so I count that against my evidence. Okay, but that shows you even the ones I count against it start to have some similarities with the main pattern. Did you want to ask a question?
Yes, I wanted to know if you thought that one way to diffuse some of the instability in the Middle East is through like a fundamental restructuring of the state system in that region. Because of course right now we have states which were drawn on lines like a map by Europeans
Yep.
at the end of the First World War.
Yep.
That brings lots of religious groups together.
So the basic answer is those lines are going to be redrawn, but not by us. And they're not going to be redrawn in a couple of years. It took Europe centuries to go through the fitting of nationalism to state boundaries. And lots of wars happened in that couple 100-year period. This is what is happening in the Middle East. What's mainly happening as a giant historical phenomenon is the misfit of national communities and political borders. Mostly because the British and other Westerners drew those borders and deliberately split those national communities to rule them. So it's no surprise that there's a misfit. However, fixing that misfit, this isn't going to happen with any amount of military force. There's not enough. Even if we had conscription and had a 20 million man army, okay, and all you guys were in the military and gals too, there's not enough force to do that. That's way beyond our control because you're talking about way too many people in way too much geographic space. That unfortunately is just going to have to work itself out.
You have to stop.
Oh, sorry.
Because there's a class.